Welcome to this video on visualization training based on step 3, thinking ahead. We're going to look at pawn endings. I recorded 2 videos on pawn endings, one on key squares and one on the rook pawn and the square of the pawn. And they are prior knowledge that you need to solve these puzzles. And we're talking about visualization. It's about having a clear image of the target position, the picture, and then the film, like how did the dynamics change in the position, and based on that we have to calculate and evaluate the variations. So let's get started. So you can see white is the move, and the moves that have been given are bishop f3, king c7. And how should white continue? And if you remember from the video on key squares, these are the key squares. So the question is, can white exchange on c6 and then occupy one of the key squares? So we continue bishop f3, king c7, bishop takes c6, king takes c6. And then in order to get to the key squares, we have to play king e4. And after king d6, king d4. So that is the solution, right? So let's have a look. Bishop takes e6, king takes e6. And the black king has to blink, and then we get to one of the key squares. And of course, when we are here, if we would play king d4, black plays king d6. And our opportunity is gone. Okay, and let's have a look here. We have king d2, king d4. Right, so at this moment, if we think about the key squares of the pawn, on d7, right, they are c5, d5, e5. And black is threatening to capture the 2 pawns and then at the same time be immediately on one of the key squares. So the only way to create any chances is by changing the structure. So white has only one chance, and that is to play e6. Black has to take, f takes e6, and then we have to force the king backwards by playing e5. Black has to take the pawn on e5, and then we play king e3, and white makes a draw. So by pushing the pawn to e6, we are changing the key squares, right? They have moved 1 rank forward. Then we push the pawn to force the king to go backwards, and then we get to a position where black is no longer able to occupy the key squares. So queen d6. Let's look at the key squares of the pawn on b4. They are a6, b6, c6. If we would capture on d6, the black king takes, and after king c4, black plays king c6, and white is not able to occupy the key squares. Of course, the black queen is pinned, so we can try king c4, right? And now the threat is queen takes d6, king takes e6, followed by king b5, and then king a6 occupying a key square. And actually, black has only one move there, of course, is to take on d5, but after queen takes d5, king takes d5, king c7, king c5, king b7, king b5, black has to blink, and white is winning. So we have king d6. If we would trade, it would be a draw. We're taking advantage of that the queen is pinned. We play king to c4, And this is the thread. I'm just trying to highlight the idea. And we are on a key square. So we are here. So we play king c4, and now if black takes, that's the alternative. We force the black king to blink, and we get to c6, one of the key squares. I hope you make this into an active session and pause the video now and then to think for yourself. So rook takes f7, rook takes f7, king takes f7. What to do with black? Black has only two moves, right? Can play king h8 or king h6. But what is the idea? White is going to take on f5, and if we just picture the situation that white has taken on f5, where does the black king have to be for it to be a draw? On f7. And then the variation becomes clear. Rook takes f7, rook takes f7, king takes f7, king h8, king f6, king g8, king takes f5, king f7. So, important to visualize and also be fluent in naming the squares. So e5, d takes e5. e5, d takes e5. How to take back? With the f-pawn or with the king? That is the question. I mean, it looks natural, of course, to improve the pawn structure with f takes e5, but then white, what would white play? White would play e4, and after f takes e4, king e4, it's a draw. So we have to try the other way. We are having double pawns with black after king takes e5. And then we think, what are the key squares of the pawn on f6? And they are, right? That are the key squares of the pawn on f6. And then it becomes, of course, clear that we can just play, white has to move their king. And then on the next move we play king e4, and then we can play f4 on the next move and win, because we are on the key squares after white takes on f4 and black takes back. So e5, d takes e5, and we said that if black takes with the pawn, which seems natural, white sacrifices their pawn immediately, and now the black king has to let go of that pawn and is unable to occupy one of those key squares of the pawn, with a draw as a result. So the alternative was to take with the king. We said the key squares of this pawn are those three squares. Right, the king has to go back. Now we just are going forward, right? Because then we are on a key square. King has to defend the pawn, we push, and we have a winning position. Okay, rook takes f5, rook f2. So in this position, right, I mean, if you think about it, you have a pawn on g2. Key squares are those three. If we want to have any chance, right, we cannot take on f2 because the white king would be too close to the key squares. So we have to play. There's only one move because we cannot lose the rook, rook f7. And then we have to calculate. Rook f2, rook f7. King takes f7. So rook f2, rook f7, rook takes f7, king takes f7. Assume that white goes king h2 to go to h3 and then try to get to either g4 or h4. Black plays king g6, and after king h3, king h5, and is safe. So we cannot take. These are the key squares of the pawn on g2. So we go here. If white doesn't trade, then we get into a drawn rook ending, and in this case we are in time, and if white goes here to g3, we also are in time to prevent the white king to get to one of the key squares. So we have a rook takes d8, king takes d8. So if we look to the current position, right, the key squares of the pawn on g3 are those three squares. So you could say if the black king can capture that pawn, it's immediately done. But we have to be prepared that black pushes their pawn to f4, right, and we have to take. So this is the current static situation, but we have to anticipate that black pushes their pawn and that we have to take. And then the key squares have changed to those three. And then it becomes clear what we have to do. We have to play king d6 to head for the new key squares after the change in structure. So rook takes d8, king takes d8, and then king d6. And now we are immediately on a key square and we have a winning position. So king a6, king c5, king takes a5. So what do? If the king takes on c6, black plays king b4, and then we lose the pawn on b2. So we cannot take on c6. If we play b4, what will black play? King a4, right? Will not go backwards, but go forwards. And then, in order to make any progress, the white king will take on c6, and then we lose the pawn on b4 after all. So king a6, king c5. There's only one move left. By process of elimination, we have to play b3. And then the black king has to go to a6, and we take on c6, and we have a winning position. So king a6, king c5, king takes a5. If we would take here, there's king b4, and we lose the pawn on b2. If we play b4, there's king a4, and we also lose the pawn, which leaves us only with b3, taking away the square a4. The king has only one move, and now let's see what the new key squares are. White can always return, right, after a move like king a5 to c5 and subsequently win this pawn landing. f4, g takes f4, king f4, g6. So what can we do? g6 attacks the pawn on h5. If we trade on g6, right, because then the only pawn that is left is the g4 pawn, and these are the key squares. If we take on g6, the king is on g6, the black king, and we are unable to get with the white king there. That leaves us with one possibility, because we cannot allow g takes h5, which is king g5, and after g takes h5, we take with the king, and we have a winning endgame. Right, so this is hopeless for white. So white has to play king g5, and now we can force the black king to blink, and we are on one of the key squares of this pawn. This one is beautiful. So bishop takes d5, c takes d5. So what is going on, right? So if you play king takes d5, bishop takes d5, c takes d5, king takes d5, black plays king b7, and after king c5 or king c6, king a6. And then black can just shuffle a6, a5 with the king, and there you cannot force the king to give up the b-pawn. Likewise, if you play king takes b5 after the exchanges on d5, the black king plays king d7, and then king e6, and then can shuffle between e6 and e5. So what to do? c3, king c7 doesn't help, because we get into the same issue that white has to take one of the pawns, and then the black king can defend the other pawn. So that leaves us only with king c6, right? And then the king has to move, right? And then we can take after king b8 we can take on b5, and after king d8 we can take on d5, because the king can no longer get to the other pawn. And if black pushes one of their pawns, we take the other pawn, because the king can again not defend the pawns anymore. So this was the line, and I was saying that if white would just go brute force, the black king can defend, right? And of course this is the same, and black cannot be forced out of here. So we play this, right? And after king d8 we take here king 6, and then we can shield off the king, we take the pawn, and alright, so let's say a b4, and we are on a key square of the pawn on c2, and we have a winning position. So king c6, and we said after a pawn move like this we can take, and also here, right, this king is too slow, and we take the pawn, and we have a winning position. I think it's beautiful symmetry to play king c6 here. We go to the rook pawns, right? So we have white to move. White is playing h5, and we have to find a defense for black. So just to repeat, these are the attacking key squares, right? And the corresponding defensive key squares, in this case for black, are those 6. If you don't remember, watch that video. So the question is, black would like to get to one of those 6 squares and not be shielded off by the white king. The white king has to capture the h pawn. So in practice, right, I think we have two lines, right? You can say my route to f7 will be like this. That's one idea. Or we can say after h5 we're going to play h6 and see if that gains us time. So let's do first h5, h6, king g6, king f4, king takes h6, king f5, king g7, and after king g5 white plays h6, and we are winning. So we have to play king e4, right? And then we go king d5 and go to f7. So in these positions, right, for me, I immediately see a route of, you could say, least resistance, where I'm not shielded off, and I'm trying to make that route work. So I'm not looking at moves, but I'm trying to figure out if I can use this route. So we have h5, right? King goes here. So let's say that white continues to push, right? So we continue our route, and then we can see that it's exactly as we planned. And the king walking over a diagonal is as fast as a king walking straight. like we all know from the Reti maneuver. Rook pawn, okay. King d4, a4, right? So a4, what should white anticipate? White should anticipate that black is going to change the structure by playing a3, right? So after king d4, a4, if we play king c4, this is the last moment that the black is able to change the structure. Black plays a3, b takes a3, and then the question is black in time to get to one of those key squares? So king d4, a4, king c4, a3, b takes a3, and black plays king e7, white plays king c5, black plays king d8, and white is too late. So white has to play a dual purpose move, right? And the dual purpose move is to threaten to take the pawn. So black still has to change the structure, but at the same time already moving to the attacking key squares, which are these two, right? And the dual purpose move is of course not to go to c4, but to go to c5. So, right, what we're talking about, king c5, the threat is now king b4 and taking on a4. So this is the last moment. And then after king a4, white would be on a key square of the pawn on b2. This is the last moment and black can change structure. And now we see that white gets to a key square and wins the game. So king c5 had a dual threat. It was closer to one of the attacking key squares, and at the same time it was threatening to capture the pawn and directly occupy a key square of the pawn on b2. So knight takes c5, b takes c5. So what is the question here, right? So the question is, can white capture the pawn on c5, right? Play king d5, king takes c5, and then run back to f2. Or is white too late? So that's what you have to calculate and visualize, right? And then that's the verification. So knight takes c5, b takes c5, king d5, king f5, king takes c5, king g4, king d4, king takes h4, king e3, king g3, and white is too late. So how to gain a tempo after knight takes c5, b takes c5? So we have to apply the principle of shielding off the black king. If king d5 doesn't work, we have only one move left, right? And that is king e5, which forces the king backwards, or forces the pawn forwards, and then we are closer to the square f1, where we can make a draw. So this move, right, so we were first looking at, this would be brute force, right, if we would play this without thinking. This is what you would play, and you see that you're just too late. So you have to insert something smart, and the smart move is king e5. Right, so you force the king one square away from, right, so if you say I go here, then I have to come back, and now white is on one of the defensive key squares. Similarly, if black pushes the pawn, I go, and now I can get to one of the defensive key squares because I was one move closer to f1. Okay, so this is interesting. So you see two candidate moves, king c3 and king d3. So we have to find the solution in both cases, right? So we have king c3 and king d3. So let's first, and there are two strategies. One for white would be to say, I'm going to push the a pawn, change the structure, and then run, right, with the king to c1. So that would be play this on a timely manner, and then get to one of the defensive key squares. That is strategy one. The other strategy would be to say, tit for tat, you're going to win a5, I'm going to win b7. Right? So you run towards my a pawn, I run towards your b pawn, you take my a pawn, I take your b pawn. That's the second strategy. So which strategy applies to which situation? And when do you change structure? So king c3, right? So let's do strategy first, the first strategy. King e3, king b4. Now we have to change structure. a6, b takes a6, king d2, and we are safe. Right, so let's see it. King c3, king e3, king b4, threatening to take on a5 and occupy a key square of the pawn on b7. a6, take, king d2, and we're just in time. So now let's return to the other line. So black is playing king d3, which makes king e3 impossible. So the black king is shielding off the white king from going to c1. So we have to deploy the other strategy. King d3, king e5, king c4, king d6, king b5, king c7, king takes a5, king takes b7. So this is tit for tat. Both capture a pawn. And the other strategy is changing structure and get to one of the defensive squares. In this case, c1. Okay, so a rook g6, a rook takes g6. So what to do with white, right? So the question is, if you take on d6, what happens? That's brute force without thinking, but you can verify it. King takes d6, king g6, king e7, king takes h6, king f8, and black is safe. So we have to find something special. So the interesting part is here that the rook on d6 is pinned. And the solution can be found in attacking the pinned piece and forcing the black rook to take on g6, after which the white pawn will promote. And the move to force that exchange is king e5. Right, so this is just to verify that we cannot just play without thinking. Oops, yeah, that's also fine. Right, so white is no longer getting to one of these squares, and black is on one of the defensive squares. So it's a draw. So let's go back. Rook g6, rook takes d6, we play king e5. Black is forced to take here, and the black king is actually out of the square of this pawn. The white pawn promotes first and can then capture the h-pawn, and white wins the game. Last example, very beautiful. So black plays a5, right? So what is going on? Right? So you could start again without thinking and say, let me play king d5. Right, I'm going first eat the pawn on e5, and then I'm going to run to the a pawn. Does white have sufficient time? Can you visualize that? So a5, king d5, a4, king takes e5, a3, and you're not in the square. You're too late. Of course, it's symmetric, so if you would play a5, king b5, and then e4, it's the same situation. So the black king is torn apart between the 2 pawns. So somehow white has to find a way to gain a tempo. Can you find a way for white to gain a tempo in this position? And the solution comes from the fact that white has an asset, which is the pawn on c6, and white can threaten promotion of this pawn by playing king d6, threatening king d7, followed by c7 and promotion. So let's have a look. a5, king d6, right? So now if the pawns would push, white would win. So black is forced to play this, and now white takes. And let's look at the square of this pawn. You can see that the white king is in the square. And after king c7, king d4, white has ample time to get to one of the defensive key squares. Thank you for joining. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you subscribe. And I hope to see you back soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.